At 63, Della Hartwell had $284 in a checking account, a Social Security check that wouldn't clear until the 9th, and a single $1 bill her mother had left her in a will. The lawyer read it out loud in a room where her two brothers sat in the good chairs. The farm on County Road 9 went to Roy. The house in town and the bank accounts, a little over $260,000, split between Roy and Dwight. To her only daughter, Della, the will said, "I leave $1 and the sewing machine in the back bedroom in the hope she will finally learn to mend what she breaks." Roy didn't look up from his phone. Dwight looked at the floor. Della had buried a husband 2 years back and paid down his hospital bills to the last month. She had no house of her own, no job that would notice she was gone, and no one left in that room who would say her name kindly. What she did have, though nobody there bothered to mention it, was a deed. 12 years earlier, her father had left her a building the whole family called a teardown. The old Hafford depot, brick and boarded up, out where the rail line quit for good. Appraised at $9,000. Used by nobody. Taxes barely paid. She drove 4 hours north with the sewing machine on the back seat and the dollar in her coat pocket. She meant to sell the place and be done with all of them. She didn't know yet about the hatch in the office floor, or the ledgers underneath it, or the 40 years Walt Hartwell had spent holding an entire county together, one quiet dollar at a time, and never telling a soul, least of all his own children. The office of Prewitt and Kane sat above the pharmacy on the square in the county seat. It smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. The chairs were the stackable kind you'd find in a church basement, except the two by the window, which were leather, and which Roy and Dwight took without being told. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks after they'd put Fay Hartwell in the ground beside Walt. Prewitt was a heavy man in a brown suit who spoke the way a man speaks when he's read the room and already knows how it ends. He set a folder on the desk, squared the edges, and put on his glasses. "I'll read the operative provisions," he said. "You can ask questions after." Della sat in a stackable chair with her purse in her lap. She was still in the black dress from the funeral because it was the only good thing she owned. Across the room, Roy had his phone face up on his knee. He was 66 and looked like money. Tanned in February, a quarter-zip pullover with a company logo stitched at the chest. Hartwell Grading and Excavation. He ran 40 trucks and 3 excavators and had built half the subdivisions between here and Fort Wayne. Dwight was 5 years younger and softer, a man who had spent his life agreeing with Roy because it was easier than the alternative. Prewitt read, "The farm, $410,000 is appraised, to Roy, who had worked it. The house on Sever Street, $118,000, and the accounts, $262,000, divided equally between the two sons. Life insurance to the sons, the truck to Dwight, the good china to a cousin in Ohio." Then Prewitt paused, and Della knew her part was coming. "To my daughter, Della," he read, "I leave $1 and the sewing machine in the back bedroom." He didn't read the rest of the sentence, the part about mending what she broke. He'd read enough wills to skip the cruelty when he could. But Roy hadn't come to let it be skipped. "Read the whole thing," Roy said, not looking up. Prewitt read the whole thing. The room was quiet after. Somewhere below them, a bell rang as someone walked into the pharmacy. Della kept her eyes on the window and the courthouse clock across the square and worked very hard at not letting her face do anything at all. She had driven up every other weekend, the first year her mother was sick. She had learned to run the feeding pump and had slept in a recliner that left her back crooked for days. Then Roy had taken power of attorney, and the visits got complicated. The gate code changed. Her mother was resting. Her mother was having a hard day. By the end, Della saw Fay 4 times in 18 months, and every time there was someone else in the room to say when it was over. "There's a waiver," Prewitt said gently. He slid a single sheet toward her, acknowledging you've received notice of the estate. "It doesn't waive your right to contest. It only says you were here today. She won't contest," Roy said. "There's nothing to contest." Mom was of sound mind. "We have the letters from the doctor." "I wasn't asking you," Della said. It was the first thing she'd said since hello. Roy looked at her then, finally, the phone forgotten. He had their father's pale eyes and none of the rest of him. "Della," he said, in the reasonable voice he used with county commissioners and unhappy customers. "Nobody's trying to make this ugly. You got Dad's building years ago. That was your piece. This was hers to give, and she gave it the way she wanted. That's fair. Fair. He said it the way other men said, Amen. You got the building, he said again, and honestly, you should thank us for keeping the taxes from going to sheriff's sale. That's on Dwight's side of the ledger, if you want to count it. Dwight opened his mouth and closed it. Della signed the waiver. 4 lines, her name in full, Della Faye Hartwell, the middle name her mother's. She capped the pen and set it down square on the folder the way her father had taught her to leave a thing better squared than she found it. The sewing machine's still at the house, Prewitt said. You can arrange to pick it up whenever suits. It's in my car, Della said. I took it yesterday. Nobody was home. That landed somewhere. Roy's jaw moved. Dwight almost smiled and thought better of it. She stood, gathered her purse, and walked out without shaking anyone's hand, down the stairs past the pharmacy, out into a raw gray afternoon that couldn't decide between rain and something colder. Her car was at the meter, a 2004 Buick with 178,000 miles and a heater that took a mile to catch. The sewing machine sat on the back seat in its case, and beside it, in a cracked accordion folder, everything her father had ever signed his name to. She got in and didn't start the engine. She pulled the folder onto her lap and found the deed near the back where she'd left it 12 years ago, the paper soft as cloth from the county clerk's cabinet. Hafford Depot, Renfrew County. Deeded to Della Faye Hartwell under the last will and testament of Walter Ames Hartwell. Deceased. She had gone up for his funeral, spent 2 days sorting his things, locked the door, and never gone back. Gerald had said the place wasn't worth the gas to check on it. She hadn't argued. She never argued with Gerald about money either. That had been the deal, in that marriage too, though nobody ever said it out loud. Della sat with the deed in her hands while the meter ran out, and a woman in a parka fed the one beside her and hurried on. Then she started the Buick, waited for the heater, and pointed it north, out of the county seat, and toward a town 4 hours away that she barely remembered how to find. The drive took a little over 4 hours. Interstate gave way to a state highway, which gave way to a county road, which gave way to a stretch of cracked 2-lane that ran alongside the old rail grade. The tracks were long since pulled up and sold for scrap, the ballast still there in a low ridge under the weeds. Della drove with the heater going and the radio off. She passed grain bins and a shuttered implement dealer and a Baptist church with a hand-lettered sign advertising a fish fry that had happened the week before. She remembered the road a little. When she was young, her father would put her on the train at the county seat, and she'd ride the 2 stops up to Hafford, where he'd be standing on the platform in his gray coat with the depot behind him, and he'd lift her down and let her ring the handbell that hung by the freight door. That was before the passenger service ended. After that, she came up by car, Summers, and learned to fill out the freight manifests and read the telegraph the county never got around to disconnecting. She could tap out her own name in Morse by the time she was 10. Walt had a way of teaching a thing, so it felt like a secret the two of you were keeping from the rest of the world. Gerald had found that charming when they were courting, a woman who knew railroad time and could read a manifest. Later, he found it embarrassing, and then he stopped mentioning it, and then she stopped doing it. The way you stop doing anything when the person nearest you acts like it was never there. The town of Hafford was smaller than she remembered. A feed store, a post office open half days, a cafe with a lit sign that said Ada's, and a row of buildings with more soaked windows than open ones. She slowed through the one blinking light and followed Depot Street to where it dead-ended at the tracks that weren't tracks anymore, and there it was. The Hafford Depot was a long, low brick building with a steep slate roof and deep eaves that hung out over where the platform used to be. Board and batten freight doors on the north end. A bay window on the track side, the operator's bay, where a man could lean out and hand orders up to a moving train. The brick had gone dark with 40 winters of coal smoke and weather. Someone had nailed plywood over the lower windows a long time ago, and the plywood had grayed and cupped. Poison ivy had climbed the chimney. The slate roof had lost a dozen tiles along the ridge, and a young sumac was growing out of the gutter. But the walls stood plumb. The roof, where it still had its slate, carried its own weight without a sag. Whoever built it 100 years ago had built it to outlast the railroad, and it had. Della parked the Buick on the gravel apron and sat a minute with the engine ticking. Then she got out into the cold and walked up to the door. The main door was oak, swollen in its frame, with a mortise lock older than she was. She had the ring of keys from the accordion folder, brass keys gone dark, each one worn smooth. The third one turned the lock with a gritty complaint, and she put her shoulder to the door, and it gave all at once, and she was inside. The air was still and smelled of coal dust and old paper and mice. Gray light came through the parts of the windows that weren't boarded and lay in pale bars across a plank floor worn into shallow valleys along the paths people's feet had taken for a century. A long counter ran the width of the waiting room, the ticket window still in it, the brass grill bent where some kid had climbed it decades ago. Behind the counter, the operator's office, and in the office, everything. The telegraph key sat on the desk on its little wooden base, wired to nothing now. A green-shaded lamp. A schedule board on the wall with train times chalked up for a timetable that hadn't run since the Johnson administration. The chalk ghosted but readable. A calendar turned to a month 12 years gone. And on the desk, beside a cold coffee cup with a brown ring dried in the bottom, sat Walt's reading glasses, wire-rimmed, one bow mended with a wrap of copper wire, folded and set down on top of a crossword he'd been working the morning. His heart quit while he was up here alone. Della picked up the glasses. She held them a while. Then she cleaned the dust off the lenses with the hem of her dress, a thing her hands did without asking her, the way she'd cleaned them 100 times as a girl when he mislaid them, and she set them back on the crossword exactly where they'd been. 19 across was filled in, careful block letters. 20 across was blank. She left it blank. There was a stairway at the back of the office, narrow, that went up to the 2 rooms under the eaves where Walt had lived the last years, after her mother left him and married a man with a paved driveway and moved south, and Walt just quietly stayed on at the depot. The county kept meaning to sell out from under him and never did. Della climbed the stairs. A bed with a bare striped mattress, a dresser, a 2-burner hot plate, and a little refrigerator that hummed to life when she found the plug and pushed it in. A window in the gable end that looked out over the old grade, the sumac and the goldenrod, and past that the blue-gray ridges going soft toward evening. She sat down on the edge of the bare mattress, and the springs sang under her. She was 63 years old, sitting in her dead father's rooms above a depot on a rail line that carried nothing anymore, with $284, a dollar bill inheritance, and a sewing machine in the back seat of a Buick. She did not cry. She'd done that already, months ago, alone, after the second funeral and before this one. What she felt now was quieter than grief and lower to the ground. She sat until the light in the window went from gray to nothing, and then she went down and slept in her coat on the bare mattress. And in the morning, the crying still hadn't come, and she decided she could live without it. She woke to a crow arguing with something outside and light the color of dishwater in the gable window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the low ceiling came into focus, and she remembered all of it at once, the whole stack of it, and she got up because lying there wasn't going to change the arithmetic. The arithmetic was $284. She sat on the edge of the bed and did it out loud, the way her father used to do sums, so the numbers had to behave. The Buick had a little under half a tank. Gas was going to be $40, whether she liked it or not. She had a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and 4 cans of soup she'd bought at a dollar store outside the county seat, and a sleeve of crackers. She had the Social Security check on the 9th, which was 6 days off, and no address yet to have it sent to. She had a building the family called a teardown, and no plan for it except the one she'd driven up here to carry out, which was to sell it, and which she was already, without quite admitting it, beginning not to want to do. She found coffee in the little kitchen, a can of it in the cabinet with a plastic lid still sealed, gone flat but not turned. She heated water in a saucepan on the hot plate because there was no kettle, and she carried the cup down and walked the building in the morning light. It was a good building. She could see that now, awake, with coffee in her. The freight room on the north end still had its scale set into the floor, a platform scale big enough to weigh a crate of hardware or a coffin, and the beam still swung true when she nudged it. Along the freight room wall, her father had built a run of shelving and cabinets, everything squared and labeled in his hand, twine and waybill blanks and lamp wicks and a whole drawer of switch keys the railroad had never come back to collect. On a nail by the door hung the handbell she'd rung as a child. She took it down, and it was heavier than memory made it, and she hung it back. She swept the waiting room with a broom she found behind the door. She washed the inside of the bay window with vinegar and newspaper until the wavy old glass went clear, and the morning came through it properly. She was up on a chair working at the top pane when she heard tires on the gravel and turned to see a truck stop out front, an older Chevy, and a man get out slow and stand looking at the building with his hands on his hips. He was big through the shoulders and gone soft with age, 70 or near it, in a canvas coat and a cap with a rail shop patch on it. He looked at the swept apron and the clean window and the Buick, and then Della came out onto the platform side and his face changed. "Well, I'll be," he said. He took off the cap. "You're Walt's girl, Della." "I am," she said. "Gus Renner." He came up and put out a hand like a catcher's mitt. "I kept the track gang out of this district 31 years. Your dad and me played cribbage in that office every Tuesday from about 1980 on. I don't guess you'd remember me. You were knee-high." "I remember the cribbage board," she said. "It had a crack down the middle he filled with wood glue." Gus laughed, a short, surprised bark. "That's the one." "He wouldn't buy a new one," said the crack was where he kept his good luck. He looked past her at the open door, at the swept floor. "What brings you up?" "Nobody's laid eyes on this place since we put him in the ground." She thought about the polite version. The version where she was up to look the property over, get an appraisal, list it in the spring. Then she was too tired to build it. "My mother died last month," she said. "My brothers got the farm and the house and the money. I got $1 and a sewing machine." She looked at the depot instead of at him. "And this. 12 years ago. Nobody wanted it then either." Gus didn't say he was sorry and didn't ask a question. He looked at her a moment, then walked back to his truck and came back with a dented thermos and 2 enamel cups, and he poured without asking. "Then you'll want coffee that ain't been in that cabinet since the Clinton years," he said, and handed her a cup. They sat on the edge of the platform in the cold with their feet hanging over where the rails used to be and drank Gus Renner's coffee, which was black and scalding and the best thing Della had put in her mouth in a month. He told her the roof had held because Walt reslated the whole trackside himself the summer he turned 70, hauled the slate up on a rope, tile by tile, wouldn't let anybody help. She listened and watched the goldenrod move in the wind and felt something in her chest ease a quarter turn. She was walking Gus back to his truck when she heard it. A small sound, out of the weeds along the old grade. A whimper, then quiet, then a whimper again. Della went toward it. In the ditch where the ballast dropped off, half under a sheet of plywood that had blown off the depot years ago, a dog lay curled against the cold. A big dog gone to bone, tan and black, a shepherd of some kind with burrs matted into his coat and a front paw he was holding up off the ground. He watched her come without lifting his head, dark eyes tracking her, deciding. "Hey now," Della said, low. "Hey." He didn't growl. He didn't run. He'd have run if he could, she thought, and he couldn't. She went back into the freight room and got the last of a soup she hadn't finished, poured it out on the plywood, and stepped back. The dog waited a long minute. Then he got up on 3 good legs and limped to it and ate it in 4 swallows and looked at her for more. "That's all there is right now," she said. "There'll be more tonight." Gus stood by his truck watching. "That's Renner luck," he said. "Strays find the one place somebody just showed up." He got in and rolled the window down. "There's a can of dog food in half the cabinets in this county. I'll bring some by tomorrow. And I'll bring my ladder. That sumac in your gutter's gonna lift your flashing if it sits another winter." He drove off, and the dust settled, and Della stood on the gravel with an empty can in her hand and a starved dog looking up at her like she was the last warm thing in the world. "Buck," she said, for no reason she could name except that he looked like a buck. "All right, Buck." He followed her to the door on 3 legs and lay down across the threshold, half in and half out, and put his head on his paws, and stayed. The casserole showed up before Della knew anyone knew she was there. She came down the next morning and found a covered dish sitting on the platform edge, still faintly warm, a scrap of paper under the foil that said, "Welcome back, Walt's girl." She stood holding it and looked up and down the empty street, and there was nobody, just the blinking light and a dog barking somewhere 2 streets over. Mountain news, her father would have called it, though these weren't mountains, just the long, low hills the rail line had run through. News here traveled the same way, without wires. Gus came at 9 with a ladder in the truck bed and 2 bags of dog food and a coffee can full of galvanized roofing nails. He cut the sumac out of the gutter and pulled the poison ivy off the chimney with his bare hands, which he said stopped bothering him around 1970, and he reset the loose flashing on the trackside while Della held the ladder. Buck lay on the platform in a patch of sun and watched them both with the grave attention of a foreman. When Gus came down, he was winded, and he sat on the platform and got his breath. And Della brought him coffee, real coffee now, from a fresh can she'd bought at the feed store. "Tell me about him," she said. She sat down beside him with her own cup. The things he didn't tell me. Gus was quiet a while, looking out at the grade where the rails used to be. "Your daddy," he said finally, "was a hard man to buy a beer for. You'd try to do him a kindness, and somehow you'd leave owing him one. You ever notice that about him?" "I noticed he never let anybody pay for anything. That's the front of it." Gus turned the enamel cup in his big hands. "The back of it's different." He seemed to weigh something, then set it down. "You remember the winter of the flood?" "No. You'd have been grown and gone by then." 2008. Creek came up over the low road and took out 4 houses down in the bottoms. County was slow. State was slower. People down there lost everything, and it was February, and there was nothing coming. I don't remember hearing about it. You wouldn't have. It wasn't the kind of thing that makes the city paper. Gus drank. What I'm telling you is, those 4 families were warm and fed inside a week, and nobody could ever say quite how. Furnace oil showed up. A man's mortgage went current when he knew for a fact he hadn't paid it. Groceries in the truck. Everybody figured it was the church, and the church let them figure it, because the church didn't know either. Della waited. "Your daddy sat right there in that office," Gus said, nodding back at the depot, and told me he didn't know a thing about it, looked me dead in the eye. And I'd just watched him load his own truck at the co-op that morning and drive it down toward the bottoms. He shook his head, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite a smile. 40 years I knew that man, and he never once admitted to a single decent thing he did. He'd own up to being wrong about the weather before he'd own up to that. "Why?" Della said. Gus looked at her. "You knew him." "Why do you think?" She thought about it, about the way he squared a folder, about the crossword he never let anybody help with. He didn't think it counted if you told. That's about the size of it. Gus finished his coffee and set the cup down. He used to say a kindness you take credit for is just a purchase. You bought yourself something with it. The only real ones are the ones nobody knows about. He got up slow, a hand on his knee. Whole county's still standing on things that man did that nobody knows about, including a few people who'd be surprised to hear it. He looked at her a beat longer than the words needed. "You ought to know that about your inheritance. It's worth more than $1, whatever the lawyer says." He gathered his ladder and left, and Della sat on the platform a long while after the dust settled, with Buck's head heavy on her foot, thinking about furnace oil and a man who'd look you in the eye and lie about being good. That afternoon she went to Ada's for the first time, because she needed to use a phone to redirect her mail and the depot had none. Ada was 70 if she was a day, with a spatula in one hand and a memory like a courthouse ledger. When Della said her name, Ada put the spatula down and came around the counter and held both her hands and said, "He talked about you. You know that? Not often. But when he did, his whole face changed." She wouldn't take money for the pie or the coffee. Nobody in that town, Della was starting to understand, would take money from Walt Hartwell's daughter for anything, and none of them would say exactly why. She walked back to the depot in the last of the light with the thing Gus had said turning over in her. Whole counties still standing on things that man did. She let herself into the office and stood in it in the dark for a minute before she turned on the green lamp, and the lamp lit the desk and the crossword and the mended glasses. And it was then, standing behind the counter, running her hand along the underside of the desk, the way you do in a room you're trying to make yours, that her fingers found the seam. It was in the floor, not the desk. Under the knee hole, where a man's boots would go. A seam in the planks, straight and deliberate, not the gap between 2 boards, but a cut, squared off, about 2 feet by 2 feet. She'd have never seen it. You could only find it the way she found it, on her knees under the desk with her hand feeling for what her eyes couldn't reach. She got down under there. There was a finger hole bored into one plank, plugged with a wooden button she could work loose with a fingernail. When it came free, she got 2 fingers in and lifted, and a section of the floor came up in her hands. A hatch, fitted so clean it had disappeared into the grain for 12 years. Cold air came up out of the dark, dry cold, cellar cold. Della found the flashlight from the Buick and shone it down. Not a cellar. A brick-lined box built into the crawl space under the office, maybe 4 feet on a side, the brick laid tight and mortared. A little vault a careful man had made with his own hands. There was a wooden crate down there. and on top of the crate a leather ledger tied shut with a bootlace, and beside it a metal cash box and a bundle of envelopes bound with jute twine. She lay on her stomach on the office floor and reached down and brought up the ledger first. The leather was worn soft and dark, where 2 hands had held it 10,000 times. She sat back against the desk and untied the bootlace and opened it under the green lamp. Her father's hand. Small, upright. The letters squared the way he squared everything. The first entry dated the 4th of October, 1979. Loaned Emmett Cole $11 against the coal bill. Babies got the croup and the house was cold. Told him pay me when the mill calls him back. It won't call him back. That's all right. She turned the page. Fixed the Vance woman's flu. Charged her nothing. Told her the railroad paid me to check chimneys along the line, which is a lie, but she'd not have let me up on the roof otherwise. Proud people are the hardest to help. You have to give them a reason that lets them keep their back straight. Page after page. Names, amounts, reasons. A loan, a repair, a load of coal, a sack of groceries left in a truck bed while a man was inside paying for the one thing he could afford so he wouldn't notice the rest. Decades of it, the ink changing color as the pens changed, the hands steady for years, and then, toward the back, beginning to shake. He hadn't kept a record of what people owed him. He'd kept a record of what they needed, and then, quietly, met it, and never marked it paid because in his book it was never a debt. Della read until the lamp was the only light in the county, and her back had gone stiff against the desk, and Buck had come in and lain down beside her with his chin on her knee. She read about a man named Renner, Gus's own brother. It must have been carried 3 months in 1988 after the shop cut his hours. She read about a girl sent to the community college in the next county with $40 for books left in the glove box of a car that was never locked because Walt made sure it never was. She read the flood entries. February 2008, 4 families, furnace oil, a mortgage brought current, and beside the last of them, in the shaking late hand, don't ever tell them. It'll shame them, and shame is a debt that never clears. She did not open the cash box that night, or the envelopes. She'd get to those. What she'd found already was bigger than money, and she knew it, sitting on the floor of the office with her father's whole hidden life open in her lap. He hadn't been a man who ran a depot. He'd been a man who'd held a county together with his 2 hands for 40 years and lied about every bit of it, so that the people he saved could go on standing up straight. Somewhere past midnight, she closed the ledger and tied the bootlace back around it and held it against her chest. Through the clean bay window, she could see more stars than she'd seen in 30 years of town living, hard and bright over the old grade. The depot was dark and cold and full of him, more full of him than it had been when she walked in, and somewhere between the last entry and the first star a thing settled in her that hadn't been there in the courtroom. She wasn't going to sell it. Whatever it was worth, and it was worth something, she wasn't going to sell it to anybody. The letter came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Della opened the hatch. It was in a stiff white envelope with a return address printed in the corner. Prewitt and Kane, the same firm that had read the will. She opened it standing at the counter with Buck asleep against the baseboard, and she read it twice because the language was dense, and then a third time because the meaning underneath the language was plain and she didn't want it to be. Her brother Roy was petitioning to reopen the estate. His attorney's letter said that the depot property, Renfrew County parcel number and a string of digits, had been undervalued at the time of Walter Hartwell's death, and that its inclusion in the daughter's separate inheritance rather than the general estate was, the letter said, an inequitable distribution that the family had accepted only in ignorance of the property's true and future value. They cited a public filing, the Old Line Greenway, a rails-to-trails project that was going to lay a paved path down the old grade for 40 miles and put a trailhead, a parking lot, restrooms, and an interpretive center right here at the Hafford depot, because the depot was the only original building left standing on the whole line. The letter said the county was in preliminary talks to lease or purchase depot-adjacent land for the trailhead. It asked the court to set aside the original distribution and either award Roy his equitable share or order the property sold and the proceeds divided. Della set the letter down on the counter, square with the edge, the way her hands did things when the rest of her had gone still. She read it once more, looking for the soft place in it, the exception, the loophole. She didn't find one. She thought about calling a lawyer. She didn't know any lawyers, and the ones she could find would want money she didn't have. The Social Security check had come, and it covered nothing much. Only the propane for the hot plate and the electric bill she'd gotten turned back on in her own name, and the dog food and the pane of glass Gus had helped her set in the freight room. The cash box under the floor had held $300 and some in old bills, and she hadn't touched it, and she wasn't going to, because it wasn't hers. It was the last of the fund, and the fund had a purpose that wasn't keeping lawyers fed. That night Dwight called. She hadn't given him the number. Ada had it, and Ada gave it to anybody who said they were family, because in Ada's world family meant something it plainly didn't mean in the Hartwells. Della, Dwight said, I want you to hear it from me before you hear it wrong. I already heard it, she said. It came certified. There was a silence on the line, the particular silence of a man deciding how much of the truth he could afford. Roy's not doing this to be cruel, he said finally. He looked into it. There's real money in that grade now. The Greenway's funded. It's happening, and that depot's sitting right on the money spot. He thinks it should have been split 3 ways to start with. He thinks Dad wasn't thinking clear when he did the will, favoring you like that. Favoring me, Della said, with a teardown nobody wanted. That's the favoring. You know what I mean? I don't think I do. She looked out the bay window at the dark grade where the trail was going to run. Dwight, you were in the room when the will was read. You saw what I got. $1 and a machine. You didn't say a word. What was I supposed to say? Nothing, she said. That's what you said. Nothing. She wasn't angry when she said it. That was the part that seemed to land on him. You always say nothing. It's the safest thing to say when you're standing next to Roy. He was quiet again. He'll spend you into the ground, Della, he said, and now his voice was low, almost kind, which was worse. That's how he does it. It won't be about who's right. It'll be about who runs out of money first, and you don't have any. Sell it. Take a third. Take a third and get an apartment and let this go. You'll come out ahead of where you are, and you're not going to win a paper war with a man who buys lawyers by the year. I'm not selling it. Why not? It's a wreck. It was always a wreck. It's a wreck that happens to be worth something now. And you can't even see that. You're just being stubborn because it's the one thing you've got that he wants. Maybe, she said, but I'm still not selling it. She hung up and sat in the dark and made a pot of coffee she didn't want, because that was the thing you did. You made coffee and you kept the light on and you waited for morning, and in the morning you were still there, which some days was the whole of what you had. Roy came himself 3 days later. She heard the engine before she saw it, and she knew it before she saw it, the deep even sound of a big new truck idling high. A crew cab dually, black, the chrome washed that morning, Hartwell grading and excavation in gold on the door. It rolled onto the gravel apron and sat a moment, and then Roy stepped down in clean boots that had never carried dirt and a quarter zip against the March cold. And he stood looking at the depot the way he looked at a parcel before he bid it, reading the bones, pricing the teardown. Buck came up off the platform, stiff-legged, and stood at Della's knee and put a low sound in his chest. Della, Roy said. Roy. He came toward her slow, hands loose at his sides, taking his time, letting her feel the size of him and the truck and the gold letters. He looked at the reset flashing, the clean bay window, the new pane in the freight door, the swept apron, and she watched him add it all up and not like the sum. You've been busy, he said, fixing up my depot. Dad's depot, she said. Mine now. It's on the deed, for the time being. He stopped a few feet off and put his hands in his pockets and looked past her through the open door at the office, the green lamp, the schedule board. I stood on this platform once. You'd have been little. Dad brought the whole family up for some railroad thing, a retirement, I don't remember. I remember thinking, my father works in a place that's dying. I couldn't wait to get out of it. He looked at her. I built 40 trucks out of not wanting to be from a place like this. And now they tell me a hiking trail is going to make it the most valuable dirt in the county. You believe that? I believe the letter. The letter's right, he said it plainly. A man who'd never had to hide what he was after. That grade's going to be worth real money, Della. The county wants the depot for the trailhead. They'll pay for it, or they'll lease it. And either way, the number's got a lot of zeros compared to $9,000. Dad didn't know that when he willed it to you. Nobody did. It got handed to you because it was junk, and now it's not junk, and it's not fair for one of us to walk off with all of it on an accident. Fair, Della said. Yeah, fair. 3 ways. Same as the rest of it. The rest of it wasn't 3 ways. The rest of it was $2. You and Dwight. I got $1. She wasn't loud. She'd found somewhere along these weeks that she didn't need to be. You didn't want 3 ways when it was the farm and the house and Mom's money. You only found your arithmetic when the junk turned into money. Something moved in his jaw. He'd driven 4 hours expecting the sister he remembered. The one who signed where the pen pointed, because signing was easier than the fight. The one who'd sat in a stackable chair in a funeral dress and said almost nothing while the good chairs were taken. That Della had made this drive worth his while in his head. And she wasn't here. "You can't afford to fight me," he said, and the reasonable voice was gone now, and underneath it was the flat thing that had always been underneath it. "I'll spend more on lawyers in a month than you'll see in a year. I'll bury you in filings. It's nothing to me. It's a line on the books. To you, it's everything you've got, and it'll be gone, and you'll still lose, and then you'll have nothing and no depot either. Or you take a third right now, today, and you come out of this the way a smart person comes out of it." "You're right about one thing," Della said. "It is everything I've got." She looked at the building behind her, the dark brick and the deep eaves and the bay where a man used to lean out and hand up orders to a moving train. That's the part you can't price. That's the part you never could. Roy looked at her a long moment. She watched the speech he'd rehearsed on the drive come apart behind his eyes, the version where she folded, where the fight was over before it started. He hadn't brought a second card because he'd never once needed one with her. "I'll see you in court," he said. He put no more into it than that. He turned and walked back to the black truck in his clean boots, and Buck barked once, low, and Roy didn't flinch, and the dually backed around and threw a little gravel and pulled out onto Depot Street and was gone. Gus came out of the freight room where he'd been the whole time. Quiet, a length of pipe strap in his hand that he'd never had any intention of using. He watched the dust settle where the truck had been. "That your brother," he said. "That's him. He always like that?" "No," she said. "That's the thing that's hard. He wasn't always." She looked down at the letter still in her coat pocket, the corner of it, and then out at the empty grade. "I don't have a lawyer, Gus. I don't have money for one. So I honest to God don't know how this goes." Gus set the pipe strap down on the platform. He was quiet a while, the way he got quiet before he said the thing he'd come to say. "There's a woman over in Renfrew," he said. "Marion Doss. Practiced 40 years, mostly up in the city. Moved back home when she retired. Property, estates, that kind of law." He looked at Della. Her mother lost the home place to the bank in the 80s. Would have been on the street at 70 years old. And then she wasn't. Note got bought up, quiet and forgiven, and nobody ever knew who did it. He nodded back toward the office, toward the floor, toward the ledger tied in its bootlace. "You might look and see whose name's in that book. I'd about bet you a day's pay. It's in there." Della stood on the platform with the cold coming down off the hills and the letter in her pocket, and her father's whole hidden life sitting under the office floor, and for the first time since the certified envelope came, she felt the ground under her go from sand to something she could stand on. Della found the name that same night. She lay on her stomach on the office floor with the green lamp pulled to the edge of the desk and went through the ledger from the front, page by page, until she found the Doss family in the spring of 1984. A woman named Alma Doss, the note said, note bought current at the bank, $140 a month, carried 11 months until the mill hired her son back. Don't let her know. She's proud, and it had cost her more than the money. And below that, in a later hand, a single line added years afterward, paid off. She never knew. Good. Alma Doss. Marion's mother. It had to be. Della copied the page by hand onto a sheet of waybill paper because it felt wrong to tear anything out of the book. And she slept. And in the morning Gus drove her the 20 minutes over to Renfrew. Marion Doss lived in a white house with a deep porch and a garden gone half to seed. She was tall and straight-backed and near 70, with reading glasses on a chain and a way of looking at a person that took the whole measure of them in one pass. Gus made the introductions on the porch and then, because he understood these things, went and sat in his truck. "You're Walt Hartwell's daughter," Marion said. It wasn't a question. "You've got his way of standing in a doorway like you're deciding whether it's safe to come in." "I need help," Della said, "and I can't pay for it. I want to say that first, before you spend any time on me." Marion looked at her a moment longer, then held the door. "Come in and tell me what he's doing to you. It's a he, isn't it? It's always a he. They sat at the kitchen table and Della laid it out plain. The will, the dollar, the depot, the certified letter, the greenway, Roy's truck on the gravel. Marion read the letter twice, turning the pages with the calm of a woman who had read 10,000 documents worse than this one. When she finished, she took off her glasses and set them on the table next to Della's copied waybill page, which she hadn't looked at yet. "This is a nuisance claim," Marion said. "Your brother's lawyers know it. They're not trying to win on the law. They're trying to win on your bank balance. Pressure until you fold. Most people fold. That's the whole business model. Can he win? Not if the property was separate. Was the depot ever in your and your husband's names? Did the two of you ever pay the taxes on it, live in it, put a nickel of marital money into it? No. It was my father's. He left it to me when he died. Gerald wouldn't drive out here to look at it. He said it wasn't worth the gas. And your parents' estate, the one being probated now, the farm and the house. Was the depot ever part of that? Ever listed in it? No. It came to me 12 years ago. It was never in Mom's estate. It's got its own deed. That's what matters." Marion put her glasses back on. "If the property passed to you alone under your father's will, and it was never commingled, your mother's estate has no claim on it, and your brother has no standing to reopen it through her. He's trying to argue that because it's worth more now, the whole family was cheated when your father gave it to you. But a thing changing in value after the fact isn't fraud. If it were, every man who ever sold a lot too cheap could sue the buyer when the road came through. That's not the law. It's just the wish. His letter says the value was concealed. By whom? Your father, 12 years ago, was supposed to know a hiking trail nobody had funded would come through and raise the value? Their own appraiser called it $9,000. Marion almost smiled. They assessed it and dismissed it and let you have it because it was junk. That was their decision. They don't get to undecide it because the junk got lucky. She stood and gathered the letter. "I'll need the original deed, your father's will, any chain of title from the county. Do you have those?" "My father kept everything," Della said. "There's a hidden vault under the office floor. That's where I found the ledger. The deed's in there too, in a crate." Marion went very still, the way people did when Della said the word hidden. A vault. He built it himself. Brick. Under the desk. Della hesitated, then slid the copied waybill page across the table. "You should read this before you decide anything. I found it last night. It's why I'm here, really. Gus told me to look." Marion picked up the page. She read the few lines, and Della watched a woman who had spent 40 years keeping her face still in courtrooms lose the fight to keep it still now. Her hand went to her mouth. She read it again. She set it down carefully, the way you set down something that might break. 1984, Marion said. Her voice had changed. "My father passed in 83. My mother was going to lose the house. I was in law school, 2 states away, no money, and I couldn't get home in time to stop it. And then one day it just wasn't happening anymore. The bank said it was handled. My mother thought the Lord did it. She went to that church the rest of her life over a debt she thought God paid. She looked at the page, then at Della. It was your father. It was a lot of people, Della said. There's a whole book of them under that floor. 40 years of them. Marion sat back down. She was quiet a long moment, and when she spoke again, the professional calm was back over the top of the other thing. But the other thing was still underneath it, and it wasn't going anywhere. "Then let's go find your deed," she said. "And Della, you asked what you owe me." She folded the waybill page and put it in her breast pocket, over her heart, where she meant to keep it. "You don't owe me anything. This bill was paid in 1984. I've just been waiting 40 years for somebody to hand me the invoice." They drove back to Hafford that afternoon, and Marion went down into the vault herself, on her knees at near 70, and came up with the crate. The original deed was in it, in a manila envelope in Walt's hand. The property passing from the railroad's surplus sale to Walter Ames Hartwell in 1971, and under it a copy of Walt's will, witnessed and notarized, leaving the depot and its contents solely to Della Fay Hartwell. Marion held both up to the light from the bay window and read them the way a jeweler reads a stone. "This is clean," she said. "Grandfather railroad to your father. Father to you. Never jointly held. Never marital. Never touched by your mother's estate." She lowered the papers. "His motion will be dismissed. I'd stake my license on it, except I don't have one anymore, so I'll stake my mother's house, which is still standing because of the man who kept these papers. But it was the ledger that changed the shape of things, and it changed it because Della decided to let it. She thought about it for 3 days. The ledger was full of secrets, and every one of them was a secret her father had died to keep because he believed shame was a debt that never cleared and that the people he'd helped had a right to keep their backs straight. She would not read those names into a courtroom. She would not turn 40 years of quiet mercy into evidence in a fight over money. That would make her brother's mistake in the other direction. So she didn't take the ledger to court. She took a different page of it to the town. She copied out, in her own hand, not the names, but the count. Over 40 years, the number of families carried. The number of mortgages quietly brought current. The number of children sent to the community college with book money left in unlocked cars. The furnace oil in the flood winter. She wrote the total the fund had moved through in 4 decades, small bill by small bill, and it was a number that made Gus sit down when she read it to him. And then, with Marion's help and Ada's kitchen as the meeting place, she let the town come to her and tell their own halves of it. They came the way news traveled here, without wires. Ada told 2 people, and by the end of the week the cafe couldn't hold them. A man in his 50s stood up and said his family's lights stayed on in the winter of '91 and nobody ever knew how. A woman said her husband's stone in the Hafford cemetery was paid for by a hand she never saw. The girl sent to the community college in 1988 was 60 years old now and taught 3rd grade in the next county. And she stood up in Ada's cafe and cried and said she'd spent 30 years wondering who left $40 in her glove box, and now she knew, and she wished she'd known in time to say thank you to his face. None of them had proof. They didn't need proof. They had 40 years of a thing they'd always half known and never said out loud, and now somebody had said it, and the saying of it turned the depot from a wreck the county wanted to pave around into the one building in Renfrew County that everybody suddenly understood they were standing on. The hearing was on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after Roy filed. It was held in a small courtroom in the county seat, smaller than the one where the will had been read. Roy sat in front with Prewitt beside him in a charcoal suit. Marion sat with Della, and behind them, filling the gallery, without anyone organizing it, sat the town. Gus, Ada, the 3rd grade teacher, the man whose lights stayed on, 20, 30 people who had driven in and put on their good clothes to sit in a courtroom on a workday for a woman most of them had known for 6 weeks, and a man all of them had known for their whole lives. The hearing lasted under half an hour. Marion presented the deed, the will, the chain of title from the county. She showed that the depot had passed from the railroad to Walt to Della, never jointly held, never part of the mother's estate, never improved with $1 of anyone's marital money. She showed that Roy's own family's appraiser had valued it at $9,000 during probate and recommended it be excluded as negligible. The tax records showed Roy had never paid a cent toward it. This property was separate before the marriage and separate after, Marion said. It was separate before the mother's death and separate after. Speculative future value is not fraud. There is no legal basis to reopen anything. Prewitt got up and said something about equitable distribution and the intent of the deceased and the interests of the whole family, and there was nothing behind the words, and the judge, an older man who had lived in the county long enough to have his own opinion about the Hartwells, let him finish and then looked at the deed and the will for a while and set them down. Motion denied, he said. The property was never marital and never part of the probated estate. Whatever it's worth today, it was Walter Hartwell's to give, and he gave it. This matter is closed. Roy sat very still. Behind him, the town did not cheer, because they weren't that kind. But a sound went through the gallery, a low settling, the sound of a room full of people watching a thing come out right for once. Della found him on the courthouse steps afterward, in the raw spring light, his jacket over his arm. He looked older than he had on the gravel 3 weeks before. The confidence was still on him, but something behind it had gone loose. "You could have just taken the 3rd, he said. "You'd have come out ahead." "I know. All those people in there." He looked back at the courthouse doors. "You paid them to show up?" "No," Della said. "Dad did, 40 years ago. I just told them where to send the thank you." Roy looked at her, and for a moment she thought something might land. Something might get through to the boy who'd stood on this platform once and decided he couldn't wait to leave. Then he put his sunglasses on and the moment closed. "I didn't know he did any of that," he said. It was almost a question. "No," she said. "You didn't. That was the whole point. He never told anybody, especially not the people who'd have measured it in dollars." She looked at her brother in the spring sun. "He knew you would. He wasn't a cruel man, Roy. He just knew who'd understand what the place was for. And it wasn't you." She walked to the Buick and drove home, and the word came without effort now, and she let it stay. Home. By the middle of June, the depot had a roof that shed water on every side and windows that let the morning in clean. Della had spent part of the winter and all of the spring on it, and Gus had spent most of his, and between them they had brought the building back to something Walt might have recognized. The slate was patched where the ridge had lost tiles, sound now, laid up the way Walt had taught Gus and Gus had shown Della, one at a time from a rope. The freight doors ran on their track again. The bay window on the grade side was glazed and painted, and Della had painted the trim the same dark green her father had always used, from a can she found in the freight room with a skin over the top that she skimmed off and stirred back to life. The county came, as the letter had promised, but it came differently than the letter had meant. The Greenway was funded and the paving crews worked their way down the old grade all through May, and when they reached Hafford, they found the depot already standing and already loved, and the plan changed to fit it. The county did not need to buy it or pave around it. They leased the platform side from Della for the trailhead, a fair number with a lot of zeros in it compared to $9,000, and they left her the building. And they were glad to, because the interpretive center they'd planned to build from scratch was already there, 100 years old and real, with the schedule board still chalked and the telegraph key still on the desk. Della ran the depot the way she believed her father would have. She put a coffee maker on the counter, in the spot where his had been, and she kept it on from 6 in the morning until whoever left last turned it off, which was usually Gus, who had developed a habit of sitting on the platform until well past dark. The trail brought people, walkers and cyclists and families, and they stopped at the depot for water and for the bathroom and for the coffee, and a good many of them stayed on the platform longer than they meant to, the way people do at a place that isn't trying to sell them anything. She did not charge for the coffee. When a man reached for his wallet, she waved him off, and he told her his father had done the same thing at a gas station on a mountain road once, a long time ago, and she said her father had done it here, and they left it at that. When a family came through short on gas money to get home, she gave them what was in the cash drawer and told them to send it back when they could, and some of them did, and some of them couldn't. And she marked it in a new book the way Walt had marked things in the old one, not as a debt, but as a need that had been met. Marion Doss came out most weeks. She had taken to sitting in the operator's bay in the afternoon light with a book, and she had, without much announcement, started keeping the depot's small legal affairs in order. The lease, the trail easement, the paperwork, the county generated by the pound. She would not take a fee. She said the retainer had been paid in 1984 and she was still working off the change. She had put the copied waybill page, the one about her mother, in a small frame, and it hung now on the office wall next to Walt's mended glasses and the crossword he never finished. 3 things from a man who'd been gone 12 years, and the depot was more full of him than it had been the day Della walked in. Della didn't hear from Roy. She heard about him, once, through Dwight, who called in April to say Roy had dropped the last of it and wouldn't be pursuing anything further. Dwight's voice on the phone was careful, the way it always was, a man standing next to a decision someone else had made. But before he hung up, he said a thing he'd never said before. He said, "I should have said something in that room, Della, when they read the will. I've thought about it." And Della said she knew, and that saying it now counted for something. And she meant it. And after that, they talked a little more often than they used to, which was not often, but was more. The stray had filled out. Buck's coat had come back in over the spring, thick and dark, and the front leg had healed with only a small hitch in it that showed when he was tired. He met every car that turned onto the gravel and walked the trail with the walkers a quarter mile and came back, keeping his own kind of schedule. He slept across the office threshold at night, half in and half out, the way he had the first day, and Della had stopped thinking of him as a dog she'd taken in and started thinking of him as a thing that had come with the building, the way the scale had, and the bell. It was on a hot afternoon in late June that the boy came up the trail on foot. He was 19 or so, thin, sunburned across the back of his neck, a duffel bag over one shoulder, and a look on his face that Della knew because she had seen it in a courthouse mirror once. The look of somebody who has learned that new places are usually worse than the last one and is bracing for it anyway. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked at the depot and the dog and Della behind the counter, and he didn't come closer. "Trail says there's water up here," he said. "There is." Della came out with a paper cup and filled it from the cooler and held it out, and he came up the 2 steps and took it and drank it down, and she filled it again without asking. His name was Cody. He'd walked the grade 20 miles that day, coming from a town where a job hadn't worked out, headed for another town where he'd heard a different job might. He had, he said when she asked, not much of anything, and when she pressed him on the number, because she had learned that the number mattered, he said $40-some, and she didn't flinch at it, and he watched her not flinch, and something in his shoulders came down an inch. She fed him at the counter, a sandwich and the last of a soup Ada had sent up. He ate the way she'd eaten for a stretch of her life, fast and low over the plate, and she didn't watch him do it. She talked about the depot instead, and the trail, and Gus, and after a while Buck came and put his chin on the boy's knee, which Buck did not do for strangers, and the boy put a hand on the dog's head and stopped chewing for a second and got his face back under him. "There's a room upstairs," Della said. "It's small. There's a bed in it and not much else. But the water's hot and it's dry, and the trail will still be there in the morning if you want it." The boy looked at her the way they all looked at her. The way she'd once looked at the first person who'd handed her a cup of coffee and not asked for anything back. "You don't even know me," he said. "I know you walked 20 miles, she said. "I know you've got $40 in a duffel bag. I know the dog likes you, and he doesn't like much." She wiped the counter. "I was where you are, not that long ago. Somebody let me stay. That's about all there is to it." He stayed. Not forever. She didn't know that yet and didn't need to. He stayed the summer, and he was good with his hands, and Gus took to him, and by August he was running the trailhead register on the days Della drove into Renfrew, and the sunburn had turned to brown, and he'd stopped eating like the food might be taken away. Whether he'd move on in the fall or stay through the winter was his to decide, and Della had learned from her father not to decide it for him. You held the door open. You kept the coffee on. What a person did after that was theirs. On an evening at the end of June, with the paving crew gone home, and the trail empty and the light going long and gold across the old grade, Della sat on the platform edge with her feet hanging over where the rails used to be. Gus was on the other end with his thermos. Marion had left an hour before. The boy was inside doing something to the register that didn't need doing, keeping busy the way people do in the first weeks of somewhere safe. Buck lay in the last patch of sun with his chin on his paws, watching the grade the way he watched everything, in case it needed him. Della had the ledger in her lap. She didn't read it as much anymore. She didn't need to. But she liked the weight of it, and sometimes in the evening she'd open it to no particular page and read one entry, the way another person might read a verse, and then close it. Tonight the page fell open to 1986, a man carried through a bad winter, and at the bottom of it, in her father's upright hand, a line she'd read a dozen times and would read a dozen more. The richest man in a town is the one who's owed nothing and owed by everyone. Walt hadn't meant it as pride. Della understood that now. He'd meant it as arithmetic, the only kind he'd ever cared about. She looked out at the grade, the goldenrod going to seed, the ridges past it turning soft in the last of the light, and the coffee still warm on the counter behind her, and the boy inside, and the dog in the sun, and the old bell by the freight door that she'd polished back to brass in the spring. She was 63 years old. She'd walked out of a courtroom in a funeral dress with $1 and a sewing machine, and she'd driven 4 hours north to sell a wreck and be done. And instead, she'd found the whole hidden shape of the man who'd raised her. And in finding it, she'd found the shape of herself he'd known was there all along. Home isn't the place they let you keep, she thought. It's the place you decide to hold the door open at. She closed the ledger and set it on the bench and left the light on inside for the boy, and she sat on the platform of her father's depot and watched the town go quiet, and the grade ran off into the dusk toward everything that was coming down it. And she was ready for it. She was just getting started.